Chapter 11. The rest of the day before H's trial was pretty boring. They were allowed to leave the room, but the hall outside was guarded at both ends. They were told that they most certainly were not prisoners, but it sure as hell didn't feel that way. Laura was pacing around with her crossbow in hand, periodically aiming it at the wall, firing, then reloading. Once all her bolts were spent, she took a funny-looking tool and dug them out of the wall one by one. "This is fucking bullshit," she said. "I could be out there right now, hunting that thing. I'm supposed to be out there right now." "Why don't you just go?" asked Jake. She paused, as if she hadn't even considered that as an option. "We're supposed to wait here until after Kangaroo Court," said Ken. "The heck is Kangaroo Court?" Ken sighed and laid back against his pillow. "Never mind." Laura began stuffing her few possessions back into her bag. "What are you doing?" asked Al. She slung the bag over her shoulder and shrugged. "I'm leaving." "I was kidding." "Yeah, well, I'm not." Al swung his legs over the side of the bed. "Then I'm going too." "You can't. You're not my dad." Jake stood. "If you're going, I'm going." A wild grin spread across Al's face. "Everybody slow the fuck down," said Ken, sitting up. "Nobody's going anywhere." Laura scoffed. "Yeah, try and stop me." "He is a werewolf," Jake reminded. "Sure as hell doesn't look like one." Ken's facial hair was getting a little thick and long, but he hadn't shaved since who knew when. He was still just some scrawny dude. Laura headed for the door, and to everyone's surprise, Ken leapt at her. He grabbed her by the forearm and held fast. She whipped around, looking like a wolf herself. Jake would have bet his life on a showdown, but she simply wrenched her arm free and took a wide stance. She glared up at Ken and whispered, "Don't fucking test me." Ken backed off. He looked like a puppy who just shit on the carpet. "How do you expect to get out?" he asked. "Well, I expect nothing less," she said. "How?" She shrugged and opened the door. "Let's find out." She stepped into the hall and checked the guards at either end, choosing to walk left. She smiled and strode confidently toward the guard, beginning to say something in gobbledygook. Before the second word left her lips, she tripped over her own foot and went sprawling. Jake snickered, then covered his mouth. Laura's confident demeanor broke. She cried out and rolled onto her back. The guard she'd been addressing laid her spear against the wall and ran to help. The other guard followed suit, and then all became very clear. With the wall and Al's shoulder between Jake and the action, it was hard to see exactly what was happening, but after a clatter and a few stifled grunts, Laura was standing and the guards were unconscious on the floor. "Woohoo!" cried Al. "Shut the fuck up!" Laura hissed. The tiny rat-hole door in the wall near where she stood opened and the brownies emerged. "What is it?" Whimsy shrieked. Laura shushed her too. She glanced around looking thoughtful, then handed Wit one of the guards' helmets. The taller goblin stared uncomprehending. She looked from Laura to the guards, then to the boys, and back to Laura. "Put it on." "Why would I?" "Just put it on, Wit," Al whispered. "We're going to catch the ghoul." "Oh no," said the brownie. "I would rather not." "I do," said Ward. The hairy one took the helmet and put it on her head. Whimsy began galloping around like she'd lost her mind, whispering, "Escape, escape." "Again?" said Wit, clearly defeated. Laura stuck out her foot and tripped Whimsy, sending the tiny creature tumbling. "We need to be quiet," she hissed, "and we need to act fast." "You're insane," said Ken. "This is insane. I'm going to bed." Jake quickly weighed his options one last time. "Al is going," he said, "and I'm not leaving the goblins with her." Ken growled and shared a look with Wit, but finally handed Jake the backpack and followed everyone into the hall. "Our parents all think we're fucking dead. May as well make it true." Laura slugged him on his good shoulder. "That's the spirit." They took a moment to get Wit and Ward outfitted, then Laura led them through the door and into the rest of the colony. The larger goblins, clattering loudly and stumbling a bit in the oversized armor, sniffed out a path that would lead to an exit. They came across only one other guard. She nodded absently to the disguised brownies, and they were able to continue on until they reached a small door in the side of the mound. The party crawled through one by one onto the hillside bathed in sunlight. Laura didn't pause. She leapt over a wooden rail to the road below, then down to the next. It took a bit more effort for everyone else to climb after. The goblins had to shed their bronze armor, pieces of which tumbled down the hill. A spinning helmet barely missed Laura's skull by a hair. She didn't flinch, just hollered up for them to hurry. "If you can't keep up, I'm leaving you behind." Jake picked up a child-sized bracer that hadn't rolled away with its brethren. He thought back to the month he'd spent in Pee Wee baseball, cocked his arm, and hucked it. It was a sure shot. She didn't see it coming. Icy shame and regret filled Jake's insides for the split second before she ducked. She turned in the direction it had come from and threw up a middle finger before continuing on. As soon as she reached the bottom, she sat on a boulder and waited for everyone to catch up. It took some doing, but everyone made it. Laura stood and pointed vaguely southward. "Zool's that way," she said. "What's that?" "Is where we'll find the fucker who gave you that." She pointed to the bandage on Jake's forearm. He rubbed the spot absently. "How do you know I'll be there?" She grinned. "You see, I'm like a shepherd. Zool's my corral." With that, they began following her across the grasslands. As the untamed smell of this country really hit him, Jake started to wonder how smart it was to go traipsing through the wilderness while two of their party still had pretty serious open wounds. He checked on Ken, who seemed quite okay. In fact, he looked very okay. He briefly considered becoming infected himself. The grassland eventually gave way to sparse trees. They were driven like snow dogs ahead into the wilderness. The woody, earthy smells were getting stronger, and before Jake realized what was happening, the trees had grown closer and taller, and they were truly in the forest. Eventually, their path was blocked by a wide stream flowing down from the mountain and off into the east. Laura paced back and forth, spitting curses into the clear water below. Jake peered down the steep bank. The water couldn't have been more than 3 feet at the deepest. "We could just cross," he said. "Be my guest," she laughed. "Imagine all the wonderful new kinds of bacteria you'll meet." Jake held his wounded arm close to his chest and stepped away from the water. Carver continued to pace. "Help me find a log," she said. They did their best to help, but there wasn't much to work with. Finally, she found a dead tree standing a few meters upstream. There was a large crack in the wood near the base, but it was a thick-ass tree. "Pooch!" Laura called. Jake, remembering again the all-wrong dog that had assaulted Ken, flinched and took a defensive stance. Al snickered, and Ken went to see what Carver wanted from him. She was leaning against the trunk, trying to tip it across the water using her own weight. "Help me, damn it!" "Yeah," said Al. "Help her, damn it!" Jake gave that a chuckle. Ken sort of walked around the trunk uncertainly. Laura made space for him, and they both pushed. They strained and strained, but nothing happened. "Some wolf you are," she said. "Not a wolf yet." She took a moment to consider this. Then, out of the clear blue sky, she slugged him hard in the jaw. Ken stumbled backwards and fell on his ass. "What the fuck, lady?" "Sometimes that works." He took Jake's hand and hauled himself onto his feet. He stood there for a moment, made a constipated face, then let out a breath and shook his head. "Didn't work." "Oh, well," she said. "Come on, everybody, 7 against 1. This tree doesn't stand a chance." Everyone crowded around the tree and tried to push. Jake found a branch and hung from it, swinging back and forth like a gymnast. Under the combined mass of their bodies, the crack at the base grew wider, and there was a loud crunching sound as the tree fell over the water at 45 degrees. Jake fell on his ass, but got right back up to help at the tree's base. Laura lifted each of the brownies onto the sloping trunk and instructed them to hop. And then she followed, climbing over the boys until she was standing on the bark. Then she slowly stepped toward the other girls. When she was about 10 feet along, she jumped once. The tree cracked again and fell finally across the stream. The impact spelled trouble for the women on the trunk. Laura, Whit, and Wart were able to brace themselves, but Whimsy fell into the water and was washed away. "You little shit!" Laura shouted. She took off her bag, flung it to the opposite shore, and jumped into the water after her. Unsurprisingly, the river had nothing on the bounty hunter, and she soon emerged with Whimsy on the opposite bank about 30 feet downstream. The group hurried across the tree to help. Al wasn't about falling in the water, so he took a bit longer shimmying across on his butt. When they met up, Laura was squeezing the water out of her clothing while the crazy little goblin was doing some sort of celebratory dance. "Are you both okay?" asked Ken. The brownie gave Carver's ankle a hug, but it was quickly shaken off. "We're fine," said Laura. "Did anyone bring my bag?" Upstream, Al was clambering over the bridge's branches. He hollered, "I'll get it." "We need to keep moving," she said. "It'll be night in a couple of hours." Ken leaned up against a tree. "Why don't we just camp here?" "By the water?" "Yeah, exactly. We could fish for dinner." It became apparent that neither Laura or the goblins were keen on that idea. "There are Naya who come out at night," she explained.
"They swim out and eat,"
Whimsy cried. "Predatory monsters that come out of the water at night," Ken nodded. "Why am I not surprised?" Al showed up a second later holding Laura's bag. "Did you make this?" he asked. Laura snatched the pack. "I modified it? That's so cool." Ken sighed and pushed himself away from the tree. "Guess we better get going." So, after a quick head count, they continued their journey. The sun was getting low in the sky, and Laura was pushing them hard. About 20 minutes in, she stopped and sniffed the air. "You smell that?" "Smell what?" "Scat." She began searching the ground nearby like she'd lost a contact lens. "What are you doing?" asked Jake. "No," said Ken. "I smell it too." He joined the search. Unsurprisingly, it was the brownie's antennae that located the source of the aroma. There, at the base of a sycamore, was a juicy pile of forbidden chocolate. "Well, we found the poop," said Jake, holding his nose. "Can we move along?" Laura crouched down to inspect the refuse. "You want dinner, don't you?" Not if it's shit." "Whatever left this," she explained, "was real big." Horrifyingly, she extended her thumb and forefinger to pinch off a little brown sample. She tested the consistency and sniffed it more closely. "Oh, God, no," said Jake. She wiped her fingers in the undergrowth and stood. "I've got good news and bad news." "Is the bad news that you just played with scat?" "The bad news is this is fresh cockatrice poop," she said. "The good news is that we're going to kill and eat it." "Say what now?" said Ken. "Which of you is sneakiest?" She addressed the brownies. "Besides you three." They didn't seem very offended by that. "Jake is pretty quiet in the wilderness," offered Al. "Gee, thanks, pal." "All right, cool," said Laura. "You and the Dougs with me." "Dougs? Brownies. Come on, cockatrices are fast as hell." The five of them split off and began searching for more signs of the creature. The goblins tasted the ground with their antennae, while Laura kept her eyes peeled for broken branches and such. Sure, Jake was able to move quietly through the foliage, but he felt pretty useless. It all just looked like forest to him. After maybe 10 minutes of fruitless wandering, they heard shouts in the direction they'd come from. They stopped to listen. There was a horrifying screech, then more shouting. "Guys?" called Jake. Almost too far away to hear, Al's voice carried through the trees. "Help!" Carver didn't miss a beat. She tore off like a bolt of lightning in the direction of the cries. The others followed after her as fast as they could manage. They reached the spot where they'd left the others, and there it was. Some draconian abomination. A feathered, reptilian beast with a long tail and an equally serpentine neck, ending in a frilled head with a razor-sharp beak. It was at the base of a tree, attempting to scramble up the bark. On a branch above crouched Ken, looking terrified. Al was a few feet away, tentatively swinging a branch at the creature. Laura saw all this and fired her crossbow at the thing. It shrieked and whipped its head around, its thin body following in a liquid, writhing motion. It spread its puny wings and hissed at her, the beet-red wattle on its neck jiggling. It made as if to charge, but she fired another bolt straight into its neck. The cockatrice shrieked in pain, but continued slithering toward them. It coiled back its long neck, preparing to strike Jake in the face, but another bolt from Laura's crossbow shot through its eye before it had the chance. The animal toppled over at Jake's feet. Laura casually walked over to retrieve the bolt from its skull. Once the coast was clear, Ken practically fell out of the tree and leaned up against the trunk, panting. His shirt was torn across the chest and bloodstained. Jake ran over and crouched down in front of him. Ken lifted his head to look at him. His nose looked bent, and the color of his irises had faded into a piercing icy blue. It really didn't look like his friend behind those eyes. "Stay back," Laura warned. Jake ignored her. He placed a hand gently on Ken's shoulder. "You all right, pal?" Ken gazed at Jake's face for a moment with a sort of quiet curiosity. Then he unexpectedly screamed and swung his arm, striking Jake in the skull and sending him sprawling. Ken leapt up and bounded off into the trees. Jake scrambled to his feet to chase after him, but Laura grabbed his arm. "Really, dude, you shouldn't." "Are you serious?" "Yes, I'm serious," she said. "He'll be fine, trust me." He stared at her, not wanting to listen. He wanted to run after his friend, but finally gave in. She just saved their lives, after all. "If you say so." "I do," said Laura. "Now help me carry this. I saw a decent campsite up this way. We'll start cooking it, and Kenny can follow his nose back to us." Kenneth found himself in the middle of the woods, staring intently at a rabbit under a bush. His heart was pounding 100 miles a second, and his breath was flowing almost as fast. He blinked hard. His eyes felt cold and dry under the eyelids, and bulged like they might escape their sockets and climb up a tree. He eyed the rabbit. He'd never seen such a fat animal in the wild. It looked like a pumpkin in December, the way its flesh spread out around it. He felt a push deep within his mind, a shrieking whistle at the base of his skull. Catch it fast. He didn't want to chase it, but he knew if he did, the whistle would stop. He leapt at the creature, missing it by an inch. The bulbous thing hopped away in terror. He scrambled after it. "You're mine, little fucker." Adrenaline surged. Time and space disappeared around him. All else became inconsequential as he galloped on all fours after the creature. In the back of his mind, he could feel his skin stretching and his joints warping. The smell of blood became stronger. All smells became stronger. He could smell the trees around him, the dew in the grass, and old musk in the air. He could smell the rabbit's skin, a sickly sweet aroma erupting from its glands. He could smell its blood and even its rectum. His vision faded into the subconscious, used only to guide him past the trees and rocks in his path as his world became one of rich, all-encompassing smells. He followed the aromatic trail until he finally caught the bunny in his hairy hands and broke its neck. Suddenly, the world came rushing back to him. He took in a deep breath, and the aches in his muscles made themselves known. The smell of blood retreated and was replaced by a throbbing pain throughout his now misshapen body. He looked down at himself. He didn't look human anymore. He was covered in thick white fur, and his hands were stretched, fingers bent and difficult to move. His skin felt hot. He looked down at the dead rabbit in front of him and was overcome by a sudden and unexpected wave of sadness. Sadness not that he'd killed something, or even that his body was so deformed, but sadness in the fact that the hunt was over. He had caught the rabbit, and the warm, endless ocean of sensation that had flowed between him and the creature was now dried up and gone forever. It felt like rocks in his stomach, and his animal instincts were slowly dulled by the refined cogs of rational thought. The rocks grew heavier. The sense of loss he felt for the chase was replaced by a sick shame. He sat for a moment, drained, until the smell of cooking meat hit his nose and the wolf within became distracted once more. He made his way back through the woods, navigating once again by smell. The sensory transformation wasn't nearly as pronounced. Rather than completely dominating his awareness, his sense of smell acted more on the level of hearing this time. He had returned to being a creature of sight. Just as the last rays of light were retreating behind the trees, he found himself in a cozy patch of large pines. Everyone was there, sitting around a golden fire, roasting chunks of cockatrice meat and snacking on berries. He stepped into the clearing. Jake, who was sitting on the side of the fire opposite Kenneth's approach, looked up. His eyes widened, and he let out a choked laugh. "Is that," he said, "is that you, Ken?" Kenneth opened his mouth to speak, but all that came out was a haunting, unintelligible moan. He nodded. It was hard to tell which was worse, Jake's expression of deep concern or Alan's impersonal clinical fascination. Laura tore a hot, juicy leg from the cockatrice and handed it to him. "Dig in, Pooch."
"No thanks, I had a whole rabbit on the way here."
Kenneth's appetite had never been so ravenous. He took the leg in his awkward paw hands and sat down to gnaw on it. It was probably the most delicious cockatrice he'd ever tasted. Jake pulled out the bottle of troll liquor.
"Still mostly full, impressive,"
and began passing it around the fire. Everyone, even the brownies, took a sip. Laura set down a bowl for Wolfken to drink from. She herself guzzled the stuff like it was water in the desert. It was fun to watch the intoxicated brownies chatting and giggling. After a point, they began slipping in and out of their own language. Wit would wrap her arms around the others, swaying and say, "Sisters," and then lapse into incomprehensibility.
Probably unintelligible even if you spoke their language.
Wolfken caught himself trying to laugh. Another unnerving howl or bark. Not quite human, not quite animal. A few of his companions jumped the first time, so he tried to limit himself to voluntary panting whenever the urge came again. As the night drew on and the fire shrank, Laura showed them how to build makeshift beds under the pine boughs. Kenneth and his friends laid in a rough triangle, heads in as they had done 100 times in his many sleepovers. He knew they were just being kind. They must have been terrified of him. Whatever the case, with bellies warm from meat and liquor, the party soon fell asleep. Kenneth was awoken sometime in the wee hours to Laura talking in her sleep. He did his best not to listen, but she sounded scared. If he didn't know any better, and if I weren't currently a lichen, he might have gotten up to check on her. He eventually fell back asleep. They awoke to the huntress kicking them not so gently in the rears. For the second time since crossing the gateway, Kenneth woke not knowing where he was. The neurotransmitters got down to their morning routine. Kissed their wives and tousled their children's hair before hopping in their cars to go clog up the freeways. And before life as usual could commence, their TVs and stereos blared with cortisol anchors recounting this week's news. "No, folks, it wasn't a dream. The body has, in fact, transformed into a wolf. As per usual, serotonin and other phenethylamines would do well to stay inside today. More on that story as it develops. Laura shouted, "Rise and shine, boys and girls, we've got ground to cover." Everyone rose and shook off the sleep. They started packing up right away, munching on leftover cockatrice as they cleaned up any trace of their presence here. Kenneth tried to help more than once, but his fucked up hands made it impossible, so he surrendered to sitting on the sidelines. Jake sipped up his pack. There was one swig of liquor left, so he downed it before smashing it against a nearby rock. "Hey, Laura," he said suddenly.
Oh no.
"What? Who's Dev?" Laura's eyes widened, and she clearly skipped a beat. "What? I've never... Hang on, was somebody going through my stuff?" She held up her bag as though it had been clearly tampered with. "Oh, I must have misheard," Jake lied. Because he had heard that name, last night when she was sleep-talking. "It's just," Jake went on,
Like a goddamn moron.
"I thought I heard..." Kenneth's low growl turned into a bark. Jake tried to open his mouth again, and Kenneth bared his teeth. He didn't mean to be so outright aggressive, but the way his vocal cords were twisted, nuance was a bit of a challenge. Jake, looking particularly hurt, but rightfully ashamed, thankfully dropped the subject. They finished packing in merciful silence. Kenneth couldn't speak for the others, or at all, but the going that morning was particularly smooth. This new half-wolf body was built for endurance. His legs had been bent in such a way as to allow him to crawl fairly easily on all fours, and practically spring-loaded so that bounding bipedally across flat land took very little effort. His shoes and clothing had been all but obliterated by the transformation, but thanks to the fur and the leathery pads on his feet, he hardly noticed. He did his best to behave like a civilized creature, but it was difficult to contain all this newfound energy. A few times he caught himself straight up acting like a dog, chasing small animals, catching sticks thrown, almost exclusively by Laura, and bounding around in circles with the equally energetic whimsy. After another hour or two in the forest, they finally broke out on a dirt road running through the hills. Kenneth was all about that. He leapt onto his hind legs and started sprinting. After summiting a hill, he doubled back toward the party and skidded to a halt.
Did you see that shit? We need to find a speedometer or a timer or...
Laura scratched him behind the ear. Probably a power move, but it felt damn good. "Hate to disappoint you, Pooch," she said, "but we're not taking the road."
Fucking stop me.
"You might not remember, but we kind of assaulted a couple of the Queen's guards."
No, you assaulted them.
"Who's we?" said Jake. "I didn't do shit." "Laura's gotten us this far," said Alan. "I think it's safe to assume that we're all considered accomplices. Taking the road with an entire goblin colony on our tail would be foolish." Laura nodded matter-of-factly.
Well put, sir. "Yes, you go and save Whimsy's life," said Wit. "We will follow her."
Laura pointed off toward the horizon and smiled impatiently.
"Well then, vamonos, putos!"
So, without any more protests, they proceeded into the hills, following the road but keeping well out of sight of it. Before long, Laura's foresight proved valid. It came first as a scent on the wind. Kenneth and the goblins were the only ones to catch it. "What's up?" said Laura.
Mormetogin.
Said Wart. "What's that?" asked Alan. "Myrmidons, goblin soldiers." Laura mounted a hilltop and peered out across the valley. "Oh yeah, there they are." The rest climbed up after her. Out on the road, maybe 2 or 3 miles back,
Hell, 20 miles? I'm a dog, not a cartographer.
Kenneth saw a sort of fuzzy brown smudge marching in their direction.
200 tops, Laura wagered.
200 soldiers? Alan cried. Laura shrugged.
Soldiers, cops, fodder. With a colony the size of Muma, 200 is like the smallest force they have. Hey, maybe we can get them to swarm Zool.
Isn't that a settlement? Like a town? With kids and shops and, I don't know, weddings? Do ghouls get married?
The fuck are you on about, Alf?
You could call it a town, she said, ushering them down the other side of the hill. Come on, we'll be there soon. Having to maintain speed with the smaller, slower members of their party over the rough terrain, it wasn't long before the Myrmidons on the road closed distance. The sound of 200 women marching in sync was almost hypnotizing. They chanted as they stepped, "Gua-ti-sha-che, Gua-ti-sha-che," presumably counting. Within minutes, they were directly parallel with the hidden group. These goblins were quite large, at least 4 feet, not counting antennae, and strong as oxen. At the front of the unit was a row of commanders. Among them was a goblin with a great crested helmet riding a pony, a female troll on foot, and 3 familiar figures. The jet-black wolf that had bitten Kenneth, the man who had seemed to be in charge of the folks that had intercepted him that night, and Heartless. The two humans on horseback, shit, is Harlow's a human, were chatting and laughing like good pals. Kenneth felt his blood boil and rush into his face. Almost involuntarily, he took an aggressive stance and began growling. Laura shushed him, even going as far as to flick him on the nose, to no avail. The black wolf stopped at the front and sniffed the air. The goblin on the pony held up a hand and the unit halted, slamming their pikes into the ground in one unified thwomp. The black wolf followed his nose to the side of the road and barked. "Fucking Tanner," Laura hissed.
Woof. Woof.
Something about the sound of that bark really ground into Wolfkin's nerves. "Guys," Heartless called out, "we know you're there. Come out and we'll all go to Zool together." Laura seemed to consider this. H was technically her employer, after all. Kenneth wasn't going anywhere with Tanner or that prick who held his leash. It took very little thought to make the decision to attack. Like a hawk after a rat, he leapt out of hiding. Tanner howled and leapt to meet him. They collided in the air, Tanner's jaws locked on Kenneth's forearm, teeth grinding on his bones. Kenneth was able to clamp down on the black dog's ear. The momentum caused them to spin, throwing them skidding into the dust in a tangled, snarling mass. Kenneth scratched wildly with his forepaws as the endorphins dulled the searing pain. His claws dug into Tanner's back, and he released his grip on Kenneth's arm. Kenneth took the opportunity to reposition himself, biting Tanner's neck near the shoulder. "Let's see how you like it." It was at that point that the others reached him. Alan and Jake were yelling for him to stop. Laura shouted, "Kick his ass, Pooch!" Then there was a burst of bright light and a crackling sound. The bolt of energy struck both wolves at once, sending them tumbling into the grass. "Now that's enough," growled Heartless. Kenneth turned to see him slipping what looked like an ankh back into his pocket. His mask was wrinkled into a stern, no-nonsense glare that was frankly uncomfortable to look at. The wolves picked themselves up. Tanner gave Kenneth a sort of nod and slunk back to sit near H's friend and nurse his wounds. Heartless dismounted, gave the black wolf a once-over, then came to check on Kenneth. His expression relaxed. "Now, Kenneth," he said, "I won't pretend to know what it's like to be a wolf." He cupped Kenneth's head on either side like he might start scratching his ears and stared straight into his eyes. Kenneth stared back into the empty holes in the man's mask. For a second, he almost thought he could see the glint of human eyes in the shadows. "But you have to learn to control yourself, okay?" "I'll let 'em play, H," said the other man. "Mark," said H, "these kids are still teenagers." "They ain't my kids," Mark said. "And they ain't yours either, are they? A wolf is a goddamn wolf." Tanner gwuffed in agreement. H sighed. "It's my fault they're here. I have an obligation." Mark laughed. "Fair enough, but it's our fault the kid's a wolf, yeah? Let us handle that side of things." H looked back at Kenneth with a strange sadness on his mask. Kenneth opened his mouth to say thanks, but all that came out was a soft woof. H smiled, nodded, then returned to his horse. "We don't have any more of these lovely steeds, I'm afraid, but you're all welcome to march along with us." They all looked at Laura, who was side-eyeing the two men. "What's with the army?" she asked. "Why's Fleischman and the wolf here?" "Oh, this?" He looked over his shoulder at the Myrmidons as if he'd forgotten they were there. "This is your muscle. You didn't think I'd screw you out of your reward, did you?" "I didn't see that happening, no." "Well, come on then." He flicked the reins. "Let's go find that ghoul." So they tentatively joined the goblin army. Kenneth kept his distance from the two guard members. "Why are you friends with that guy, H?" Something about it didn't sit right with him, but he had to admit that it was entirely personal. When he really thought about it, the whole debacle by the gateway wouldn't have happened if they hadn't tried to run. It wasn't too much longer, 2 hours tops, before the troops were halted again. They could see Zool down over the next hill. It was a wretched sight. A walled-off settlement no bigger than 1 or 2 square miles that seemed to have grown upwards instead of out. Some of the block-like shacks had even spilled over onto the walls. It was like every ghoul in the world had been crammed into one tiny box. Once they were sure it was safe to proceed, the unit descended toward the gates.